I am here with Michael Henry Dunn, and we're going to be talking about the resurgence of or reconstitution of the Templars, global accounts, and that's a whole different subject. And the rule of law is how he puts it. I'm not so sure I would use that title, but we're going to talk about that. Michael Henry Dunn is a well-known commentator on the global collateral accounts and created the widely seen Changing of the Guard video exposing the banking cabal's abuse of the trillions in off-ledger gold. Let's see, he wrote several dozen widely read posts. He wrote several dozen widely read posts from Indonesia, where he worked directly with Neil Keenan, many people will know that name, for several months in early 2013. He's an authority on the Shakespeare authorship controversy, and he serves on the Sovereign Council of the Sovereign Magistral Order of the Temple of Solomon, is a senior editor of the Alliance Journal, an academic publication devoted to thoroughly researched articles on the unfolding expose of the corrupt oligarchy with an emphasis on restoring human rights through enforcing international law. Okay, so that's the short bio. And you're also a trained actor from the Juilliard School, so want to put that in there. And apparently you did have a stage career for a number of years, correct?
Right. I wouldn't say I was from the Juilliard School. I did attend the Juilliard School. I attended University of Illinois at Chicago, Knox College, Rosary College. I was in the advanced program at the drama division at the Juilliard School. So yes, that is certainly part of my background. And yes, I'm a classically trained actor, and I had a stage career mostly in Chicago, which is where I'm from, in everything ranging from original plays to Shakespeare, cabaret, musicals. And then I moved to Los Angeles, ostensibly to further my acting career, but at that point, my interest in meditation took the front seat. That had always been a really big part of my life, and I pulled back from the entertainment industry and worked as a vegetarian cook in a monastery for several years in order to immerse myself in meditation and ashram living, because the life of an actor didn't exactly have the discipline that I knew I was going to need if I wanted to get serious about spirituality. And so then I focused on my work as a writer. I was a story analyst for CBS Entertainment in the movies and miniseries division for several years. I wrote several screenplays. And it was about that time that I became interested in the Shakespeare authorship controversy, which I had always thought was just a bunch of hooey. When I was in the Chicago Shakespeare repertory, somebody would bring up the idea that it was Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe, and it drove me nuts. I just hated the idea. And the standard brush-off from people who, like me, we loved Shakespeare, therefore we loved the guy who was superimposed on the works. The standard brush-off was, oh, you people who can't accept that a middle-class kid from a provincial town could be a brilliant genius. He had to go to Oxford or Cambridge. He had to be some lord. He had to be, an upper strata persona. That was my off-the-cuff brush-off. But in the, I think it was about the late 90s, a monk, actually, who I worked with, gave me a book, which opened my eyes, and then I began to just really delve into the research. And it's really it was a great training ground for the work that I would later do on the global collateral accounts and the whole unfolding story of the cabal and the freedom movement and what all of us are involved in at this time, because it was an example of conspiracy theory, right, dismissed out of hand, backed by enormous, overwhelming evidence that it requires enormous denial to be blind to. The vested interests protecting the Shakespeare orthodoxy have billions of dollars and academic careers and prestige and everything invested in this. They use ad hominem attack, personal attack, obfuscation, confusion, all the tactics and all the debate and the back and forth in that arena, which I became very involved in. I was a trustee of the Shakespeare Fellowship, which is a not-for-profit, which at that time was based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, dedicated to the scholarly revelation. And that I came to be involved with them when I met Dr. Roger Strittmatter, who was the first American scholar to win a PhD from a major American university, University of Massachusetts, with a dissertation based on the premise that the Shakespeare plays were written by someone else, in this case Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. He was given access to Edward de Vere's personal copy of the Bible, which is in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and it was heavily annotated. It's beyond doubt that this was Edward de Vere's personal Bible. He underlined, he wrote little passages, he wrote little notes, and Dr. Strittmatter wrote his dissertation revealing a heavy correspondence between the Shakespeare themes seen by scholars for the last 200 years and the specific underlinings and annotations in the De Vere Bible. So Roger introduced me to the Shakespeare Fellowship. I became very involved and became a trustee. And I was very involved in a number of conferences and debates. I went around the world and the country with a one-man show, Sherlock Holmes and the Shakespeare Mystery, which I've done many places. And so to sort of give a fast forward, that once I became involved in the unfolding story of the global collateral accounts, I was already pretty thoroughly trained in the backstory of lost history that threatens a vested interest. I was pretty thoroughly trained in the give and take of a vested interest fiercely protecting their turf, with scruples not in sight. I was also pretty thoroughly trained in how to distill that into an entertaining presentation of a story that would make sense to the general public and cut through the confusion. So as this began to unfold, and when I first started writing with Neil Keenan, it was as if I was primed and ready. I had the storytelling skills built for this.
Okay,
so
but I'm going to stop you right there because I don't want you to leave the subject of the Shakespeare mystery without, completely explaining who Shakespeare really was in your view and why. Okay.
The Shakespeare plays were written by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. There are a few other hands in there. Scholars have always known that. But for most of us growing up in Western culture, we are taught by teachers who, high school teachers don't care so much. But at the college level, they are given a story that they were given by their teachers, who were given it by their teachers. It's accepted wisdom. And the underlying primary evidence went unexamined. Because by the time people began to look critically at the Shakespeare biography, which is not until the 18th century, there was already this whole culture of idolatry around Stratford. And it only began to emerge that there were significant, unique, bizarre problems with this story in the early to mid-1800s. As people idolized Shakespeare more and wanted to learn more about his life and began to dig, you run into a very significant problem. Now, up front, I'm going to do your viewers a favor and encourage them to check out a website called doubtaboutwill.org. Just doubtaboutwill.org. It's sort of the Shakespeare authorship version of the 1200 engineers and architects who have gone on record as doubting the 9/11 story. There are about 1,100 degreed academics who have publicly signed a declaration of doubt, saying it is reasonable. In other words, it is not crazy. You are not by definition nutso. There is valid reason to seriously doubt the authorship attribution to William Shakespeare of Stratford of what is known as the Shakespeare canon. To me, the most damning, I mean, there's tons of damning evidence, but the fact that, how do we know somebody wrote something, right? Okay. Now, you go back to the contemporary record. We have his name as the author, but then there is a paper trail that is left by, you get paid to write, somebody writes a letter mentioning your writing, you write a letter mentioning your writing, there's a record of education that you were trained in a certain area that you were writing, other people write about your writing between letters to them. These are essential documentary trails that any biographer, any responsible scholar will look at as primary contemporary evidence when they were alive. The evidence we have that established the Stratford man as the author is posthumous. And when you look at, say there's 10 or 11, there's a wonderful book by Diana Price called The Unorthodox Biography of Shakespeare, New Evidence of an Authorship Problem. And when you go back to those 11 categories that I just mentioned, record of education, record of having been paid to write, record of patronage, and you take 26 different writers from the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, okay? And you look at what we have on those guys, from prominent people like Ben Jonson to obscure people like, Lilly and Kidd and people like that, we have tons of documentary evidence from their lives. Letters by them to others, letters about them between others, record of education. In some cases, we have 10 or 11 extant pieces of evidence. It's voluminous. One glaring exception. The most famous, the most beloved of them all, we have no contemporary literary evidence that the guy wrote a word. And then you have things like, his children were illiterate. I'm sorry. Shakespeare's children being illiterate. He came from an illiterate family. He grew up in a nearly bookless town. He never left England. And then you get into the other side of the case. We like to keep on the Oxford side, as we refer to ourselves, the Earl of Oxford side. We like to keep the Stratford people on the defensive by just saying you could not arrest your man as a writer. And there's 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices who, in a moot court, looked at the evidence and said, sorry, we're lawyers. We look at evidence. You can't arrest this Stratford guy. And the circumstantial evidence indicting Edward de Vere of the crime of being Shakespeare is overwhelming. It is, lawyers look at this and they're used to just the weight of circumstantial evidence. It's beyond the beyond. The coincidences.
Okay, so can you delineate some of the evidence pointing to de Vere then?
Okay. All right. Where to begin?
I mean, we don't have to exhaust the subject, but if you can give me some bullet point evidence that people do look at, and because it sounds like you've got a very strong case, and possibly this whole thing has been settled a long time ago. But just for the sake of the show that we're doing, just
okay. Edward de Vere was first identified as Shakespeare by a man named John Thomas Loney in about the year 1920, and people had been looking at various candidates. There was a big vogue for Francis Bacon, and they were into cryptography. Bacon was Secretary of State for King James. He was a spy master, and it is known that he used cryptography. So they spent a lot of time looking in the works for a secret code that would reveal the true author. They never found it. There was a big vogue for Christopher Marlowe, very persuasive in certain evidence, but major holes. He died in 1593. He was stabbed through the eye in a drunken brawl, and a lot of the plays were written later. So Loney he decided, okay, let's just look at the works. What do the works tell you? What must this man have done and been and learned? Where must he have gone? What must he have learned? What are his associations? Where can we logically look for this man in this world at that time? So he had to be deeply studied in the law, because Shakespeare's legal knowledge is vast and perfect. He is almost never wrong. And he uses legal phrases and allusions constantly, so he had to be a lawyer. Okay, he had to be an intimate of the court. There's vast, the intimacy and familiarity and high-level, almost top-secret stuff that's in the plays, only a high-level courtier would know. He'd have to be fluent in Greek, Latin, Spanish, French, Italian, and possibly Hebrew. Orthodox scholars won't accept that, but many of the plays were not yet translated from their original language. He had to have been able to read them in there. He had to have traveled in Italy. He had to have... anyway, to cut to the chase, Edward de Vere suddenly emerged from the shadows as having all of that and more. His life story basically reads as Hamlet. Polonius, in Hamlet, the advisor to the king. Scholars know he was based on Lord Burleigh, Sir William Cecil Lord Burleigh, Lord Treasurer, the Queen's closest advisor. And Lord Burleigh was Edward de Vere's father-in-law. So think of it, if you know the play, Hamlet's in love with Ophelia. Ophelia's father is the advisor to the king. That is Polonius. Basically, Edward de Vere, everybody knows Hamlet is Shakespeare's most autobiographical character. He speaks the author's thoughts that we find everywhere else throughout the canon. Edward de Vere's life story and situation is basically Hamlet all over without the prince. Without the prince title. And there are those who say he was that as well, that he was actually the hidden heir to the throne. Hamlet is captured by pirates crossing the English Channel, right? And is released naked on the shore. Edward de Vere was captured by pirates crossing the English Channel, and he was later released naked on the shore. In Henry IV, King Hal and his friends stage a mock robbery on the highway between Rochester and Gravesend, right? It's a famous incident in the Henry place. At age 21, well, Edward de Vere and his pals staged a mock robbery on the highway between Rochester and Gravesend at the exact same place at the exact same age. If you want to get into the hardest evidence, then we have things like there is an early, the first, what is known as Shakespeare form sonnet was written by Edward de Vere. The sonnets, don't get me started on the sonnets, oh my God. I mean, I could go on and on. The whole point about the criticism, let me wrap up this part by saying, the criticism leveled at the Oxfordian theory by the Orthodox is precisely this, oh, well, you have these 1,000 points of light, right, of circumstantial evidence. And so they do what defenders of the oligarchy do. They will nitpick you to death on some little point, try to destroy your credibility on some small point, while ignoring the forest, right, for the tiny little bush they want you to focus on. The big picture story of the forest is overwhelming. The best book I can recommend on it is Shakespeare by Another Name. I'm looking over at my copy here. You'll find me in the acknowledgements. By Mark Anderson. It was published by big New York publisher. Anyway, Shakespeare by Another Name, great book. It's a very thorough biography. The recent film, Anonymous, by Roland Emmerich with Vanessa Redgrave. It got a bad rap from the critics because they criticized the theory rather than the movie. It's a gripping, wonderful movie. It's like Amadeus to me. It's as moving as that. So, does that help? Does that?
Yeah, I think that's sufficient. I think that's very good. Now I have a sort of an unusual question for you. Do you think that you have a reincarnational memory that links you to this time and these personages, so to speak, that made you so wrapped up in all of this?
You know, I don't know, Kerry. I mean, it's nice to think so. I really don't know. You know, I know people who have past life memories. I'm not one of them.
Okay.
I can make conjectures. You know, yeah, it makes sense that I was in Elizabethan England. I've probably been in India a few times. I was born in Chicago with an English accent, which my brothers, used to mock me for when I was a little kid. So, yeah, I don't know. It seems likely. I mean, that degree of
Yes.
fascination, and I think it's probably a good bet that I was around in Knights Templar times as well.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. No, it's always fun to kind of look at things because people do get involved with things for personal reasons. It thinks something captures your imagination, yes, but you a lot of times have a tie that goes beyond the current history. So
Yeah,
it's worth
it moves me very much, like every time, just because when you read Edward de Vere's life, I mean, he was a very flawed, very passionate, very brilliant, mercurial, troubled man, like a writer. Hello? It wasn't a grocery guy who King Lear, okay? It's a very deeply troubled soul. But, the justice of having our appreciation of that remarkable soul be placed where it belongs is something that I find very moving. And it's just an amazing life story.
Well, let me ask you this. Did he contribute, as one of the films I think showed, I forget which one it was, that it's possible he actually chose Shakespeare. He was chosen to cover the real author. I mean, isn't that the story?
Yeah, well, there's a writer named Thomas Nash, who was a good friend of Edward de Vere's. And there's a letter, I think it is, by Nash to someone in which he says, the people are not aware, the people who are not the deeper seekers of the secrets of states are not aware that there is a policy of plays. In other words, the theaters were being used by the regime, by the Queen, specifically for propaganda purposes. Now, she had a genius playwright who was her former lover, I think that's pretty well established, who resented being used in this way, and yet at the same time, his fortune, he was born like the richest earl in the realm and died one of the poorest. His fortune had been largely actually frittered away between the Earl of Leicester and his own guardian, William Cecil, and his own profligacy. I mean, he's just lavishly patronized other writers. But he needed money, and the Queen gave him an allowance, £1,000 a year. That was a huge sum. It was more than she paid for the running of the National Post Office. She gave in a Secret Service document to Edward de Vere, no accounting called for, starting in 1586, all until she died, and then it was renewed by her successor, King James, mysterious £1,000 a year to this man. Every single year this was paid to him. And we don't have anything that proves this was a quid pro quo for being her genius propagandist, but it's a very persuasive, especially in the light of Thomas Nash's statement about the policy of plays. And he was de Vere's close friend.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you for that. I think that people will find that very interesting. Do you want to say the name of the book that you wrote? Certainly the play, his bio is on the page on my site where we're going to be posting the video as well. But
yeah,
the name you wrote a book, isn't that right?
No, I wrote a one-man show which I perform and which is also available on DVD. If you want to just go to YouTube and do a search on Sherlock Holmes, Shakespeare, Michael Dunn, you'll get a nice little 8-minute excerpt that comes up from a performance I gave in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And if you want one of the best books out there to read, Gotham, I think the publisher's Shakespeare by Another Name by Mark Anderson. Wonderful book.
Okay, very good. All right, so now to move to the global accounts and how you got involved in that, really from the beginning, how and why?
Well, it's very interesting. A friend of mine tried to get me interested in the Iraqi dinar, right? And he said, no, you should invest in the Iraqi dinar. It's going to revalue. It's going to revalue like tomorrow. Okay, this was in late 2011, right?
Okay.
So it's going to revalue. It's worth 1/10 of a penny, and it's going to be worth $3.63 tomorrow, right? Okay. So, well, it's only $60 to get yourself whatever it was, 250,000 dinar. So I said, okay, well, let me check this out. So I began to check out the story. And that story leads to a lot of different places if you just start following the threads. In terms of the Iraqi invasion of 2003, the mirroring of what they wanted supposedly to do with the dinars that they did with the Kuwaiti dinar in the first invasion, the invasion of Kuwait. That was before the internet. People didn't really know about it. It was a behind-the-scenes deal, and supposedly the Bush cronies just set up, they said, well, we're going to take down this state. The currency's going to collapse. Let's just all buy up a lot of it, and then behind the scenes, bingo, it revalues, and, we all make an obscene amount of money. So that supposedly took place. And then fast forward, it's, part of the declassified pre-invasion planning for the Iraq invasion of 2003 that they would do the same thing, that all of the Saddam Hussein currency would become non-current, and a new currency would be created, and that this would actually help pay for the war. And then supposedly later it was tied in with oil credits and guaranteed the U.S. like $30 a barrel in perpetuity. You read all kinds of things online. But on the face of it, and the presidential directive from Bush, from W, making it legal for Americans to buy Iraqi dinar. Now, in all probability, if this version of the story is true, that was simply done in order to enable Bush cronies to be able to buy it because they thought they were going to do a quick turnaround. Well, they blew the insurrection, they blew a lot of things, and it wasn't a quick turnaround. 7 years of mayhem, bloodshed, and suffering by the Iraqi people later. They didn't have a government. The UN had not yet taken them out of Chapter 7 over the original invasion of Kuwait. All kinds of things that were supposed to happen to trigger the great reval that by this time, all the soldiers, the contractors, their families, everybody hanging around Iraq for 7 years has gotten wind of it, gets back to the States, and becomes this thing. Now, is there somebody back of all that using it as a scam? Is the Bush family managing to sell a bunch of worthless dinars? I don't know. It certainly doesn't look very good for the dinar today. But it led me to start checking all this stuff out. And so, I was simply someone who was, and because I had this training in the Shakespeare authorship controversy, I had reluctantly looked at the evidence around 9/11 and to my horror concluded that, yes, our government was complicit and super-governmental agencies were complicit, which I had fiercely wanted not to believe. But I think it was a book called Second Pearl Harbor, is probably the most dispassionate and cold, hard, unignorable facts to recommend to people. So I had training in this kind of thing. So I read pretty deeply on it, and I started to follow, your site. I followed the David Wilcock financial tyranny thing, and then it was like, here's this Neil Keenan guy, and what a character, and this gutsy guy going after the Fed, and all these, cabal entities, and and like a lot of us at that point. And then Drake came onto the scene, and it's like the mass arrests, and it's Keenan and the lawsuit, and the liens on the federal banks, and the liens on the G7 central banks, and it's all going to hit, and 4th of July fireworks. Drake is saying, get ready for the big event. And, I'm following this, and nothing happens, and nothing happens. And then it's like, oh, the liens got withdrawn, and like a lot of us out there, I was following it and wondering, well, what happened to Neil Keenan? What's the story? And by this time, I had started to write contributions on Gene Haynes' 2012 Real Truth site. And some of the things I wrote there got reblogged widely elsewhere. And so my writing came to Jean's attention. She began to work closely with Neil behind the scenes. And at a certain point, she said, hey, I'm working with Neil Keenan. I really like your writing. I think, when all this shakes out, he could probably, use your services. I said, well, that would be great. And where it began was Neil at that point, now we're talking late 2012, was looking for where to file the case. It had been withdrawn in New York. Basically, the Obama administration switched out the judge who was looking at it to put somebody else in. This was clearly a signal that they were not going to let it go forward in any meaningful way. And Neil also wanted to refile in the correct jurisdiction with stronger evidence which was coming to hand, because there were people on both sides of the cabal who were now fighting each other and trying to provide evidence against each other. And so I was brought on to write a preface to the lawsuit, essentially about a 25-page preface outlining the story of the global accounts, outlining the off-ledger gold, back to China 2,000 years ago. Basically, a shorter and differently emphasized version of a lot of the story in David Wilcock's Financial Tyranny, plus a lot of other research I had done, and focused specifically on Neil's story with Neil's input. The purpose of this preface was to give the court, a judge, a historical context to evaluate the case, to put it in its true context. And so I did that, historically and morally, just very unapologetically morally, about the horrific vastness and obscenity of the crimes that were committed by the oligarchy in the course of this. But I made it, it's a very sober-toned thing. It's supposed to be a legal document. So I was working on that for Neil, and I had not yet met him. We'd only been in touch by Skype. And in early December of 2012, Neil was in touch with the elders in Indonesia who have been the guardians of the bunkers and tunnels. There are 93 of them throughout Indonesia, where much of the gold and the notes and other assets have been stored since after World War II. And they had done ceremony with him and had told him that they had been looking for him, that they believed he was there to help them, and they warned him that, according to their own spiritual guidance, he needed to rattle the cabal's cage. He needed to get it out that the elders had given him their blessing, and he needed to do it fast. And so he put together a little, 4 or 5 minute video of himself in his hotel room in Jakarta talking about, I talked to the elders and they blessed me. And Neil's this charming, irascible, irrepressible guy, right? But as the first introduction to the guy who's supposedly, going to be helping move the global collateral accounts into legitimacy, for me, I'm in Hollywood. I've been in LA for 20 years, and I'm not a PR person, but I could look at this and go, you need a little edification here. You need a little setup. You need something that puts this in context. You just put this out there, and most folks are not going to get who you are, and they're not going to get the context. So I said, let me put something together. I ran a script past him. He approved it. And this was a rush thing. This was like, the elders told him, you need to get this out right away. Our feeling is they're going to try a major false flag thing. You need to get this out right away to let them know they're in trouble and rattle their cage. So he did this thing. It's a pretty good piece of work, I must say. I had help from a good friend on the music and another good friend on some of the graphics. But as a 7-minute historical, revelation in what I hoped was, a combination of Hollywood documentary, National Geographic style. It opened a lot of people's eyes. Because David Wilcock featured it on Financial Tyranny, it immediately got hundreds of thousands of hits. David mentioned my name in the Financial Tyranny thing, and so suddenly, because I posted it on my own YouTube thing, a lot of personal stuff about me was out there that I had not anticipated. There's good and bad to that. But it was basically a big boost for Neil's cause. That was clear. So 2 months later, he brought me out to Indonesia, and the idea was at that point, we were wrapping it up. There was going to be an agreement signed. It was going to be an announcement to the world. The elders were going to sign an agreement. We were bringing in, the Empress from China, who was supposedly the lineal heir to the Qing dynasty, claimed too much of the Kuomintang gold that ended up in the collateral accounts. 85% of the gold in the accounts is said to be Chinese family, the upper families of China, historically. So what actually happened, though, was not that, because we were focused on getting Nelu out of jail, who is Martha Wabawa, who was a young man who was working closely with Neil and was wrongfully imprisoned. And this was Neil's point guy. Neil's a very loyal man, and we're going to get Nelu out, and he's going to deal with the elders, and he's my point guy, and we're going to move the accounts, but it's got to be Nelu, he's the guy. And so we spent most of our time in prison waiting rooms, in courtrooms, or in shopping malls. Shopping malls because that's where Neil likes to hang out. But and then we also spent a lot of time dealing with the perception of a policeman on the global accounts. A lot of the work that we did and a lot of the posts that I wrote, Neil has a wide array of contacts and relationships. A lot of people knock him for that. It's like, oh, he's connected to the CIA, or he's connected to, underworld figures back in the States. He's also a good friend of John Paul II, Neil knows a lot of people. For somebody in that situation, you want somebody who has intelligence contacts, has underworld contacts, has Roman Catholic Church contacts. At least that's my feeling about it. And yeah, Neil's a rough edge guy, but he's a good guy trying to do a good thing. So what we were doing, a lot of information was coming into us in Jakarta about what was going on with the accounts, about various attempts people were trying to make to basically finish their scams before the new sheriff showed up in town. So a lot of the posts I wrote were specifically exposing stuff that was coming up because people started to get the idea that the game was up with scamming the global accounts. And then there was a major episode with the OPPT where it seemed they were attacking Neil's work. I tried to broker a peace understanding. That held for a day until they put out some material which was just inflammatory and alarming. And so we had to...
But, and this is getting a little convoluted, but I kind of want to cut to the chase on a couple things. Yeah. So sure. My understanding is that basically Neil, actually, strangely enough, was connected to Benjamin Fulford, who then connected him to Leo Zagami, of all people. So in a strange way, this wraps into Camelot, what are basically Camelot witnesses, from years ago that were connected and somehow got connected. And then through them, Leo Zagami was connecting Neil to the Vatican Bank. Daniel Bosco came into the story, and right. and it got into the UN. Somewhere along the line, Ray C. Dam factors into the story, and his group, which I don't know if that's the OBBT or whatever.
No,
and
it's not.
That's different. Okay, and then on top of it, what happened was ultimately Daniel Bosco stole the bonds, and it seemed like Neil Keenan was actually sort of just a fall guy. This is how it appears, at least to the outside viewer, because he strangely enough, turned everything over to this guy Bosco, who worked for the Vatican, and the last thing, who's basically appears to be a gangster for all intents and purposes. And then, and from then on, they were no longer in his hands. The Indonesians, their whole motivation appeared to be wanting to get involved, take those bonds, take that money, and turn it into what you call these, they're called high-yield trading programs. And that was really what the Indonesians wanted to do from the beginning. And they were just using Keenan as sort of to try to broker those relationships that would then open those doors to them, because that's a very closed game.
Right. Well, it was not the Indonesians who came to Neil in the first place. I mean, it was the Dragon family. It was not the Indonesians. And Daniel Del Bosco signed an agreement with Neil governing his custody of those bonds, very specifically governing exactly what he could do and what he could not do. He could not try to place them in trade. He could not try to, use the instruments in any way. He was solely to have custody of them and bring them where and when Neil required for the purposes of moving the bonds into a free energy project. That was the purpose. And I have seen that document. It is actually part of Neil's 110-page lawsuit. You can still access it online. And Danielle
Which he actually withdrew. He filed the lawsuit, I guess it was in New York, and then he withdrew because I had a person investigate all of this.
Right. But, I mean, just in terms of Del Bosco, that he violated a sworn agreement and stole the bonds.
Right.
And he then, Neil followed the trail of Del Bosco tried to take them to the UN. He tried to take them to, where can I launder these? First, he offered Neil a $50 million bribe. Then it was $100 million. Come on, let's just split this. Tell your Chinese friends, sorry, no go. Let's just split this up. 50 million to you, 50 million to me, and and we'll take them to whomever else, and tell your Chinese friends, sorry, it just didn't work out. Well, that's not who Neil is, and he had an obligation to his clients, and then a friend of his was killed in connection with information that came from Ban Ki-moon in a telephone call. Joe, his friend, called him up and said, the information I've just got from Ban Ki-moon will knock your socks off, but I can't tell you over the phone. I'll be there in 2 days. Well, he was dead the next day. So, it became very personal for Neil.
So what's the fallout, though, from all of this? I mean,
Well, the fallout, I mean, I would like to look at the benefit of it all. First of all, Neil, if you ask him what he does, he says, I'm a crap stirrer. I stir crap. He doesn't say crap, but, I'm a monastery kid. I'm not using Neil's language. So, so Neil stirred the crap, right? Basically, Neil exposed this whole story on a level and to an audience that knew nothing about it. He basically blew the story wide open. That is a huge, huge contribution. And, Neil, my personal experience of him, it's not so well known that he was a star athlete in college. He played pro ball in Europe in basketball, and he's a point guard. And my experience of Neil is, here's a guy he's bringing the ball up the floor, and he's intuiting what's happening, and he's improvising, right? And yeah, he's a team player in that he knows what guy's going to be open, but Neil's running the show, and he's improvising, and he's really good at it, And he opened this whole thing up to this huge audience. Now, I mean, the guy used to drive me crazy, Neil has to run the show. People would come to Neil offering funding. Neil needed funding, but funding meant control, and Neil didn't want anybody telling him what to do. Nobody's told Neil Keenan what to do since his last job shoveling snow back in Rhode Island, right? He runs his own show. I mean, I sat at a hotel lobby in Jakarta with a Korean billionaire, and I said, Neil, just listen, please, out the door. So, but it's Neil's show,
Okay, but what show is that if the bonds are gone? I'm sort of missing that.
To bring it back to what I realized from my own efforts and from my own work was that if it's about putting the collateral accounts into humanitarian programs, about an agreement between the nations, between the depositors, because the elders don't own the assets. They are the guardians. The depositors own the assets. That it's about what realistic scenario is going to actually move the assets into humanitarian programs. It's going to be an alliance of the nations under international law, and it's going to have to take on the cabal, and it's going to have to do so with enforceability, and it's going to have to do so with like the non-aligned movement. It's going to have to do so with the BRICS alliance. It's going to have to do with this emerging global alliance against the cabal and against what NATO is doing. And it's not going to be, a one-man show. And,
Right.
so...
Okay, but at this moment, from what I understand, he withdrew his lawsuit. The last I heard, he was going to try to file it again. I don't think he ever has. However, the bottom line is also that Daniel Bosco still had turned those bonds, from what I understand, over to to the UN, and also to somehow, I believe, Davos, Switzerland. That organization got involved in it. And I think it was Cheney, if I recall. His name was involved. There were a number of other people. So
Right.
those bonds are now forever out of his hands, right?
I don't know whether that's true or not.
Okay.
First
but
of all,
currently,
let me make something clear. I am not working with Neil Keenan right now.
Sure.
We're friends. I talk to him once in a while. I don't know specifics about what Neil is up to. He
Okay.
plays his cards close to the vest. What he tells the public is that he is looking for the correct jurisdiction to refile his suit, and he's strengthening his evidence. And in the meantime, he's working with the stakeholders in the accounts, right? And there's raids on the accounts by the bad guys, and they're corrupting the elders. And now Neil is exposing the corrupt elders. It's all there on his site. You can check it out. What cards he's got close to the vest about refiling, I don't know.
Okay.
I am not privy to Neil's inside plans.
all right. But have you followed the story since then?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I was writing stuff for Neil up until December of last year. Before I was getting more and more involved with the Templar Order and with the emerging Global Human Rights Court, and I was doing less and less work for Neil, and finally we had a friendly, you go this way, I'll go that way in December. We've kept in touch, but yeah, my last information is basically that he's looking for jurisdiction and trying to strengthen his case.
Okay.
For myself, I think it's all these systemic oligarchic crimes, the cabal crimes, need a legitimate international court. And I know you're skeptical about the rule of law, Kerry, but and I know all these people are quote unquote above the law, but that's the problem. They can't be, and the human family's got to enforce the law.
Okay, well, and we can definitely address that. Just a few more comments, though, or questions, just to find, sort of tie this up here before we go into that direction. If you followed this story, did you also follow the story of, of the gold in the Philippines, and in Indonesia and various other places? Did you follow that? Did you study that? Did you look into all of that? And did it augment your understanding at all? And did you learn anything that might be valuable, to tell people here who are also trying to follow the money, so to speak, and figure out, where things go? I mean, do you feel that you got any better handle than anyone else by vis-a-vis your closeness to at least the Keenan part of the story?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I know it's real. I mean, yeah, I wasn't in one of the bunkers, but, I would say that the best piece of learning that I might pass on about this is that we should not assume, we should not decide that the whole future of the planet, of cabal control over the planet, of a viable financial system that protects freedom and human rights is dependent on getting the gold from the cabal. I once believed that. I no longer believe that. I think that what is most likely to happen is that because right now it's on the cabal's turf, it's on brutality, bribery, coercion. That's the cabal's turf, Okay, and it's on the legal level. It's on confusion and obfuscation, and and political chicanery and maneuverings at the upper level, and then brutality down at the bottom level. So it's on their turf right now, and that's their turf, right? Wealth is not just about yellow metal in the ground. And it's my own belief that eventually the assets will come into play, they will come into humanitarian programs, but it's not going to happen next week or next month or even next year. And that this idea that, even one man as well-intentioned and gutsy as Neil Keenan is, and God bless him, Neil may have things up his sleeve I don't know about, but the idea that one man can pull this off and make a big announcement tomorrow that, hey, the gold is all free now, and, and we're all, within a few months, things are going to be a lot better. And Neil never promised pie in the sky. He told people it was going to take some time, but there was this expectation. I think the global collateral accounts scenario, it's real, the gold is real, and the human community needs to, under international law, with enforceability, take care of that issue among 100 other crimes the cabal is committing. Systemic violations of human rights, from chemtrails to propaganda to destabilization to false flags. These are all specific violations of specific international laws that are binding on all UN member nations. And to me, that's the real solution. I mean, yeah, the gold is real. Neil's a gutsy guy. He's doing a great thing, and he may pull off something I don't know about. But in the bigger picture, it's not like the gold is the answer. That would be my best piece of
Okay, but at this moment, in terms of related to the dinar, the global settlements, there are a lot of people out there that actually think that this is the so-called answer, at least for their, sort of immediate short-term concerns, let's say.
Well,
and they have been led down a garden path. And I'm just curious, in terms of your own trajectory, have you continued to follow that out? Do you read, and do you, are you connecting with people along those lines and listening to the sort of buzz out there about all of this stuff? Are you getting any interesting information along those lines or not?
I'm following it, but it's not my main focus right now. So I probably know only as much as your most well-read listeners know on that score. We're going to move to asset-backed currency. We're going to end the fiat currency thing. That is the cabal's engine. That is going to happen. When that happens, Iraq is a very rich country, minerals and oil deposits and everything else. Their currency should be worth more than a tenth of a penny. It should be worth about, whatever. Something like the Saudi rial is $7, and, somewhere between the Kuwaiti dinar at $3.40 and Saudi, somewhere at $3-4. Who knows? But it's certainly not going to, in a world with asset-backed currency, the Iraqi dinar is not going to be worth a tenth of a penny. How we get there, I do not know. But again, I do not have inside info on that.
All right. So in terms of now to change gears a bit and go into the Templar side of things, which I know is your current area of focus. And maybe you might also start this discussion out by giving a little bit background as to why and how you ended up with that kind of focus.
Okay. It grew out of my work with Neil Keenan, specifically because he put me in touch with the Grand Master of the Order. And that had to do with international law that we were specifically working on. A lot of our time was spent trying to get Nehlu out of jail. And the good news, my last conversation with Neil, is that, I hope so, that Nehlu's going to be out soon. He's a wonderful young man, and he has a family, and I'll be very happy to see him out. But we were focused on getting Nehlu out of jail, and there were specific violations of international law regarding due process that we were looking at whether we could hold the Indonesian judges accountable under international law and put some pressure on them. So I was put in touch with Judge Matthew, and I worked extensively with him on the background of the various international courts of human rights, the Arbitration Court of International Justice is the human rights court that is now under development that I'm volunteering for. But looking at the ICJ, the ICC, these treaty-based courts, I started to work closely with him on the principles of human rights and international law as they are expressed in these various courts, and the huge number of crimes that do not get addressed. Now, at this point, when I was working with Matthew, we weren't talking Templars at all. This was simply, I was absorbing information to distill it into a post that I was writing about how to bring justice to the Nehru situation, and hopefully in a bigger light as well. And once we successfully, I wrote that post, and it was a pretty strong one. I mentioned in passing, by the way, Neil tells me you're involved with the Knights Templar, and that is an area of great interest for me. It always has been. What can you tell me? And so then Matthew just opened the door. And I can do no better than direct people to knightsofsolomon.org, which is an amazingly rich historical trove of the authentic heritage of the real Templar order. And it is a revelation. And while, history's fun to read about, and, mystical knights with ancient esoteric knowledge is fun to read about, and, the Holy Grail is fascinating, and as someone whose spirituality is tended towards reverence for the divine feminine, the Mary Magdalene story is fascinating. That's all great, right? But this is an intense geopolitical moment. And I was really excited by the idea that the banner of the Knights Templar, of everything that is at the heart of Western civilization ideals of knighthood, chivalry, justice, the Holy Grail. These are things that we talk about every day. They're part of our psyche, they're part of our cultural heritage, they're the good stuff, right? That the banner of the Knights Templar could be meaningfully raised in an inspiring way such that knighthood and a quest for justice and to defend the downtrodden and to protect sacred knowledge, that could actually be real in the world again. I mean, I wanted to believe that, but I was pretty skeptical. Point by point, I have been convinced. And what kept me involved was the geopolitical impact, was the fact that if you go to the blog page on knightsofsolomon.org, you will see some very hard-hitting stuff about the geopolitical impact, about the fight against the Cabal, about specifically naming the Illuminati, about the fact that this is actually what the Templars have done from the beginning, from 1118 AD. The rule of law on the planet is widely acknowledged to be Magna Carta. It comes from Magna Carta. Magna Carta was a Templar project from beginning to end. They fought against the financial tyranny of that day to establish what became the basis of human rights across the planet, what became the basis of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. It's, the heart of the Gettysburg Address. It's enshrined in the UN Declarations on Human Rights. That is a core Templar mission. And people automatically assume, Templars are Masons, it's tainted by Freemasonry. No. The true Templars had no affiliation with the Freemasons whatsoever. The Freemasons began 250 years later as an isolated regional subgroup for the purpose of building a chapel, after which they had their own development, pursuing much more ambitious and non-Templar projects and eventual infiltration by the Cabal. A lot of good Freemasons out there who don't know the story, but there is no affiliation between the Templars and the modern Freemasons, just to make that very clear.
Okay. Now, before you continue, just because people will be interested, was your interest in the Templars also based on bloodlines or family lines of your own?
Not at all.
Okay.
I come from, Irish immigrants. I'm proud of my Irish heritage. Bloodlines has nothing to do with it. There's the nobility page on the website talks about nobility in its original sense. Yes, as a sovereign nation state, as an order of chivalry recognized within the protocols of international law, canon law, and chivalric protocol, the order has the right and legal ability to bestow titles of nobility. But this is not nobility in the sense that I'm better than you and now my kids are going to be better than you. No, it's the old sense of noblesse oblige. It is a call to service. It is actually an obligation to try to live up to a higher level of service to humanity. And I think of Star Wars, actually. If you think about Star Wars for a second. Now, George Lucas, the Jedi Knights, the Jedi are actually, that's an ancient Egyptian guardian priesthood. The Jedi were essentially the lineal doctrinal predecessors of the Templars. So, in a very real sense, if there's a Jedi order on the planet, it is and has always been the Templars. Princess Leia, right? And her mother, Princess whatever, the other one from the following prequel, was an elected princess serving for a period of a few years as a service to her country, right? It is a concept of nobility as an obligation. You have certain skills, certain commitments, you have demonstrated certain character, so you are being given a certain level of responsibility, and we have a title that goes with that, and you better live up to it. So it has nothing to do with bloodlines whatsoever. Now, there are bloodline Templar organizations that trace their lineage, and they have every reason to be proud of their Templar bloodline heritage. That's not us. And they were not granted recognition as the lineal continuation of the order by the descendant of the original king, King Fulk of Jerusalem, who first granted the order its sovereign patronage in the year 1118 AD. That is what makes the sovereign magistral order of the Temple of Solomon the lineal direct continuation. It is a fact of international law. So there are bloodline Templar organizations out there. There are Templar-influenced organizations out there. And we say, wonderful, we have no desire to discredit or compete with anybody. We are open to sharing. The thing is that, as Prince Matthew likes to say, big part of our job is to put all the secret societies out of business by sharing all the secrets. So there's no need for the secret societies anymore. Anyway, long-winded answer, but I hope does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And let me just say for the people listening and who are wondering now, Prince Matthew was interviewed by me a few weeks ago, and we had this unfortunate echo on his side of the voice. The audio, and because it's live stream, I don't have a lot of control over that sort of thing, but I'm going to have to, we did everything we could to try to fix it, and we're going to have to do a re-record, basically, in order to get that interview out there in a good shape. But it is out there, a lot of people are seeing it, and just so people understand, when you're referring to Prince Matthew, that is Prince Matthew. His real name is he's an American. I'm not sure where the prince comes from, other than as part of his familiar, his family line. And I don't know if it's self-assigned or if that came from the Isle of Man.
No,
okay.
It is a legal nobility title within the UK constitutional monarchy system. He is a prince by virtue of the independent kingdom of Man, which is a non-ruling royal house, which was legitimized and recognized by Queen Elizabeth II a few years ago, reluctantly, but she had to acknowledge that King David of the independent kingdom of Man is directly descended from the Stanley Kings, and that therefore, under international law, that is a non-ruling royal house which retains certain what's referred to as fons honorum rights, which is specifically the legal ability to bestow titles. And therefore, and he also has the legal ability as the direct successor of King Fulk of Jerusalem, because the Stanley Kings, who were the kings of the Isle of Man, before it was annexed by the UK, has nothing to do with current governance of the actual Isle of Man. Okay, just to make that very clear. It's a non-ruling royal house, but it has fons honorum powers, which essentially, to answer the question, Prince Matthew's title is a legal nobility title, as legal as any other noble title within the United Kingdom. So it is not self-granted. It is an authentic title of nobility, legally. And I can show you the funds. I can show you the letters patent if you want.
Right. And some of that I think I think we might have shown a little bit of that on my interview. As I recall, I do have some paperwork here that you gave me and you wanted me to show. I don't know if this is appropriate time to do so, or whether we can get into that in a few minutes. But just because it is confusing, I think, to people, why would why would somebody want to be recognized or even go under some kind of jurisdiction of the Queen of England, so to speak? In other words, why would one need that kind of recognition to do anything when that monarchy is from what I understand, there are people who can prove that monarchy is illegal. In fact, it's not even bloodline related authentically.
Right. Well, that very well may be true. I mean, that's actually related to the Shakespeare story, and Princess Diana,
yes,
and the Earl of Southampton,
yes,
and why some people believe Diana died the way she died. I don't know, Kerry. It
gets very. I know. I'm just throwing this out because I know people.
It doesn't change the fact that Great Britain, from high noon Christmas Day 1066 down to today, as a kingdom, as a cultural, imperial, historical entity, right? Formidable global impact, cultural impact, from Magna Carta to Shakespeare to the Beatles, okay, is not something that can be dismissed lightly simply because one corrupt, possibly reptilian, illegal family got slipped in there. The traditions and international and canon law that govern these things does not become invalid simply by virtue of whether or not the Windsors are evil or for real or whatever they may be. And this is I'm really glad you asked this question, because to me this touches on something that we see throughout the alternative media right now, which is the tainting of a valuable institution by association with cabal corruption, right? Like, forget about the UK monarchy system. It's those freaking Windsors. And we know about the pedophilia, and we know and the bloodline thing, and everything else. Come on, don't talk the Queen, don't talk the UK. Okay, we have just thrown out the entire heritage of Great Britain, from Magna Carta to Shakespeare. It's like that. It's intimately tied up with that. But no, we're going to throw all that out. Let's take the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, the pedophilia, the corruption, everything else you can come out with about the Roman Catholic Church. If you bring up the Vatican, it's a buzzword in alt media. It's like, well, we have an ally at the Vatican. Vatican, you guys are obviously disinfo cabal agents because you're having something to do with the Vatican. Well, no, I grew up Catholic, okay? I went to Catholic school, right? St. Edmund's Grammar School, 200 South Oak Park Avenue, Oak Park, Illinois, and I had nice nuns and nice priests, and I didn't get abused. And I know of, good missionary, devotional Catholic nuns, and I know of vast good that is done by people who want to be close to their Creator, who happen to be Catholic. Now, does that mean that anything I do, interacting with a Catholic official is therefore tainted because of what? And Do we think that the cabal doesn't plan this? They are tainting everything deliberately in order to make us discard our own most valuable institutions. And the whole idea of like, well, we have to invent something totally outside. We just come up with something. We'll do a common law court. We'll do a citizens grand jury court. We'll just something, we'll just invent something because everything else is tainted and we can't work with it. So we'll just, like OPPT, we'll come up with something. We'll just invent something. Well, they love that. The cabal loves that. It puts you on the fringe. It makes you ineffective. It takes you out of the way the world works. It makes you ridiculous in the eyes of the unawakened mainstream. I was like, I don't know, there's some citizens grant. It's conspiracy theorists, right? They love that. And then, of course, they put in infiltrators who make it more ridiculous so that they can have, the more highly paid agitators who are paid to look even more ridiculous to make us look even more ridiculous. This is all familiar to you, right?
Okay,
so what we're
absolutely.
doing, basically, as a main strategy with the Templars and with the court, what we are doing is saying, all right, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? Look to the mainstream, look to the maverick section of mainstream and work within. There is a UN reform movement within the UN. You can't just say, oh, they're affiliated with the UN. Our website has a UN logo on it. We're a registered UN NGO. That's a really valuable status for us. It's one of the 3 criteria over on the Arbitration Court of International Justice page. You have to be a UN NGO as well as being a licensed non-governmental court of justice to trigger statutory authority as a global human rights court. You can't throw out the UN. You can't throw out the Roman Catholic Church. You can't throw out the heritage of Great Britain. And yes, the monarchy and everything that went with it. All right? You can just, that is a knee-jerk reaction. And so we all get pushed to the irrelevant, inefficient fringe where we try to find the infiltrators and we try to find the truth, and there's ETs and there's cabal and there's global collateral accounts and Keenan and Wilcock and everybody else. And in the meantime, the actual lever we actually get our hands on is the enforcement of international law and human rights and statutory authority working within these organizations, working within the UN, but,
Okay, well,
reform.
This one assumes, and well said. I'm not sure that I agree or that what people would agree, but I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate it.
Okay.
And it's legitimate. It's a good argument. But so at this moment, it's clear that that's the direction in which you're working. Are you having any success?
I would say yes. If you look at what has been achieved, and at this point, go to isis-security.org and to the Justice Court page. That's isis-security.org. And yes, we're keeping the ISIS. Sorry, you're not going to discredit an Egyptian goddess by virtue of the current NATO proxy,
right.
Doing bloody chaos in Iraq. Yes, we are making progress. Some of it, just in terms of operational security, I can't really go into, but it's essentially all there on the website in terms of having established the court, having established its authority, its statutory authority. Now, I am not an international judge and lawyer, so I can talk about the Templars and Shakespeare, like second nature all day long, but I'm not an international lawyer, and these things don't flow off my tongue as easily. But I will quote you from my notes, so conveniently taped up here. Okay. The differences with other global courts. I'm going to try to make this really concise, okay? What makes the Arbitration Court of International Justice real? That's a big accomplishment. And how can it address what needs to be done? I'm going to run quickly through the existing courts so people understand, right? There is the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, this allows claims by individual or private victims only after exhausting domestic remedies, which means essentially spending a couple $1 million of your own money until your own country's violations have been exhausted, right? Good luck with that. It's not a judicial body, the UN Human Rights Council. It takes only advisory, it has mediation measures, no enforcement power. Is that going to do anything against the cabal? No. International Court of Justice, ICJ, has jurisdiction only for countries bringing claims against other countries. It does not permit individuals to file a claim against the country for human rights violations. And essentially what we are focusing on is the cause of the problem is massive systemic human rights violations by an oligarchy. That's the real problem. There was a priceless bit, it's on the Alliance Journal, alliancejournal.org, an article in which a UK military guy was indignant that the International Court, I think this would be the International Criminal Court, was actually taking UK military to task and investigating them for some violation that might have taken place in Afghanistan by UK military. And this guy, this British general, comes out and says, no, the ICJ, the International Criminal Court, is for warlords in developing countries. That's what that court is for. It's not for the most prestigious legal system in the world. Right? In other words, don't dare to actually try to take to justice, a white military guy, right? We put this court up for dark-skinned people in developing countries, warlords, etc., so we can have a show trial once in a while of how great we are in human rights. Okay, then there's the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction only for war crimes. It's not a forum for claims by any individual victims of human rights violations. Then you have the European Court of Human Rights. Only EU citizens can file, only on violations by EU countries, Russian federations included. Only, again, after exhausting domestic remedies. Spend a couple $1 million of your own money and then come see us. Inter-American Court of Human Rights theoretically allows citizens of any country to petition, but it's only violations by South American countries, only after exhausting domestic remedies.
Okay,
there's a similar one in Africa. So, okay, I'll go ahead.
No, that's good. So now let me ask you this. So you're going to, you've got this other sort of body, this court. And,
okay, I don't have it. It's not.
All right. Well, we're discussing this, right? And the name of the court is again
the Arbitration Court of International Justice, or the ACIJ.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Now the question is, because I see how actually even the European Court does bring up sort of decisions that involve even the United States and the cabal and things they've done. But in essence, it seems they have no teeth. They can't really enforce anything. The United States walks out and says, no, thank you, I'm not interested, whatever it is. So how do you deal with that?
Okay. Those courts are essentially by treaty. And a country is therefore able to withdraw, right? Let me read you this. These are treaty-based charters, right? That is one way to establish an international court of justice. It is not the only way. The traditional human rights courts are based upon the treaty principle by which countries agree to voluntarily submit to the jurisdiction. Now, the good thing about this, it allows for the easy creation and immediate official funding of a court, because all the different countries, they fund it, right? But it is severely limited by allowing countries that have the option, to just avoid jurisdiction at their will and convenience, like the U.S. did, right? So, however, a treaty-based charter is not the only way. There is statutory authority in existing international law. Let me just quickly go through the bullet points on this. Specific provisions of international law enacted by the UN General Assembly, binding on all UN member nations, fully authorize and empower an independent, non-governmental court to exercise jurisdiction over matters of international law. Now, this is, according to international law, a court must have it has to have official licensed status as a non-governmental court from a national Ministry of Justice of a UN member country. Okay? So, To give you an idea what that means, just imagine here in the U.S., I wanted to go to Eric Holder, and I say, Eric, look, I hate these human rights violations by the cabal. I'd like you to give me a license from the Department of Justice to set up a non-governmental court of human rights with global jurisdiction. You okay with that? Right. Is that going to happen in the U.S.? Not likely, right? Okay.
Well, part of the problem
So
is that Eric Holder is a member of the cabal, you know.
Yes,
that's a whole
yes,
other
of course.
matter,
Yes.
but okay, yeah.
Right. So the court has to have that. It has to be licensed by the Ministry of Justice of a UN member nation as a non-governmental. In other words, it's not part of that country's government, right? Non-governmental court. It must have formal UN registered status as an NGO, okay? And it must also have an infrastructure and foundational basis which is fully consistent with all details of the relevant body of international law. Now that's a pretty high barrier to meet, to have all three of those things. A license from the Ministry of Justice of a UN member nation as a non-governmental court of international law, UN NGO status, and the third bar is the hardest to reach, an infrastructure, foundational basis. In other words, charter, rules of evidence, rules of procedure, everything that the international courts have in their founding documents. And the Arbitration Court of International Justice, which is an autonomous subdivision of the Institute for Sovereign International Security, has all those things. And so therefore, under international law, we have statutory authority. And here's the question everybody wants to get to. Great. Okay, enforceability, please. What happens? You come out with some judgment. Enforceability, what are you going to do? In terms of seizing assets and putting people in jail, all you need, once the court has made a judgment that a certain, damages are to be collected or a certain individual is to be arrested, all you need is the cooperation of one non-aligned movement country out of some 170 countries. One country that is willing to seize the assets of, say, a G7 nation whose embassy has bank accounts or other assets held by that country in their territory, or to issue an arrest warrant for an individual should he come within the jurisdiction. All it needs is one country to be willing to enforce that judgment.
Okay, but
and then
given
the ball begins to roll.
Okay, now I appreciate that. And given a one world government,
Matthew said the same thing.
Okay, but given a one world government that is let's really cut to the chase here, because you're a really smart guy, and I appreciate you're a wonderful writer. You're obviously well-intentioned individual, and I believe Matthew is as well. But let's look at this, because we're dealing with the cabal is not limited to country. We're talking about many people would say corporations that are going across borders, and above that, I mean the triangle of power. It goes way beyond that, and so really, whole countries are being run by. My understanding is there is a body of 3 or 4 men at the very top who are probably well aligned with certain different races of beings who are in essence running those what are continents, not countries. So what we're talking about is not a country-based thing. So let's take one country. Let's just do hypothetically. Okay, what would that one country be that would go up against this body that we're dealing with? Because let's really deal with what we've got. What we've got on planet Earth right now is not someday one world government, but actually one world government that is very fast, getting its whole police state in order, et cetera, and running things, using 2 arms, basically, of the eagle, so to speak, as Jordan Maxwell would say. The Russians on the one hand and the U.S. on the other, and orchestrating, wars at will and so on and so forth. So like a football match, they get everyone below them to think that, they're at odds, when in reality, the head at the top is running everything, both sides of that equation. So if we look at that ball game that we're part of, and we look at what is going on, let's take one country. Would that country be, let's hypothetically, it's not going to be the Isle of Man, because you've already established that the Isle of Man is not in the Isle of Man
It's
has
not a
nothing
country.
to do with
It's
this
part of
this.
the UK.
Yeah. So to
No,
pick
they
one
were-
country, Switzerland. I mean, who?
Just before let me just pause a moment to make an emphatic point.
Okay.
The Isle of Man is part of the UK. It's no connection whatsoever between the independent Kingdom of Man and the actual territory of the Island of Man, which is part of the United Kingdom.
Right.
The Order of the Temple of Solomon has nothing to do with the Isle of Man. Prince Matthew has nothing to do with the Isle of Man. And King David of the independent Kingdom of Man has nothing to do with the actual Isle of Man. There, okay.
Yeah, I know.
All those
That's
Manx
all good.
folks out there,
Okay.
all those good Manx folks who are going, who's governing us? It could be any country. It could,
I know, but let's do a hypothetical. I mean, because what happens when that country?
I want to take issue. I want to take issue with your premise.
Okay.
First of all, okay, and I know that your premise is based on a huge amount of information that you have absorbed over the last 7-8 years, and specifically recently, in terms of there being the football match with the puppeteers of the 3 or 4 men at the top who are the actual world government, and that any struggle going on down here below among us to actually establish human rights and sovereignty and human freedom and things like that is just, the nice little delusion they like to keep us busy thinking we're doing. I don't believe that. I'm sorry. I do not accept that premise.
Okay.
I have observed that one of the things they really not only love to do but need to do is make us believe they are a lot more powerful than they are. And they have really specific disinfo programs that are very specifically intended to make us believe they are a lot more powerful than they are. It's the elephant and the rope and the spike in the ground that he could pull out, only he believes it holds him. Now, what I believe is so, it's all about evidence in the end, fine. If you show me the evidence of the 3 or 4 guys at the top, that this is all being run by them.
Okay, let's go to this a different direction, and I appreciate that, because certainly I believe, let me play the other side now. I believe that the people and the consciousness field that we're a part of actually is the true power on planet Earth. But when all's said and done, I'm just kind of like putting this out as a sort of play, and you of all people can appreciate that. In other words, let's take a country as a sort of test case, a scenario, and what would happen under those sort of,
Okay.
maybe even, and because some people will say, oh, well, the BRICS, that's what's happening there. It's the BRICS. They're already associating into a whole group that is now acting against the cabal. I mean, that's the premise of a great deal of certainly the alternative media, seeing the world in that way. I don't see it that way, but I appreciate that they do. So what then is the pushback? In other words, it is interesting to think about it because we look at the rule of law and we're actually dealing, again, I don't think you can disagree with this, that the cabal operates outside the law.
Right. But there's a very important point to make here. Like, for example, you take the UK right now. There's an article in I believe it's The Independent, and you can find it on thealliancejournal.org, where mainstream media in the UK does an investigative article on Freemasonic corruption used in criminal syndicates within the judiciary and the police, covering for each other in the UK. Okay? Now, is the system of law corrupt beyond repair and broken? No. There are individuals committing crimes within that system. You say they operate outside the law. No, they are criminals breaking the law. That's all. They just are not called to justice. They are crooks breaking the law. That's who they are. They're not this. What they want us to believe is they're this shadowy, all-powerful, influence that floats everywhere and controls everything. No, they're crooks, okay? And there's laws. And if they get busted, they go to jail by somebody who's willing and has the enforceability to put them in jail. Okay?
Right.
Because this is, again, part of the, they love to make us think they're this, shadowy, all-powerful entity. Are they formidable? Are they infiltrated everywhere? Yes. I'm not kidding myself or you about that. But let's talk about you. It seems to me, Kerry, you were asking me, give me a forward path that goes somewhere and means something. Am I reading you right?
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, sort of in a general way.
Because what I'd like to do, let me just reframe it a little bit. Shortly, within the next 2-3 months, the Institute for Sovereign International Security will be publishing a judge's manual of human rights enforcement. And this will be distributed worldwide free of charge to human rights activists, human rights lawyers, people everywhere who are simply on the ground fighting, suffering, fighting violations of human rights. This judge's manual, to me, is revolutionary because most people are unaware of the very specific international laws that are being violated, that are enforceable against chemtrails, false flags, COINTELPRO, disinfo, destabilization, you name it. Every single one of those crimes is a violation of international law that is binding on all UN member nations. Now you can sit and say, okay, pie in the sky, Michael, who's going to enforce it? How would it ever happen? Put that judge's manual in the hands of human rights workers worldwide, and suddenly they realize they have the force of law, and there turns out to be a venue, an emerging venue. And by the way, it's not a brick and mortar venue where everybody's going to be flooding the gates of one building somewhere in the world trying to process all these cases. It's a lot more agile than that. That right there will be a flood of specific indictments of this whole range of crimes. And we need to come together as a human family on the rule of law and its foundational basis of centuries and put these crooks in jail and seize their assets by the peaceful rule of law. Yes, it is going to call for enforcement, it's going to call for seizure of assets, and yes, it will call for cooperating police and military. And I'm not oversimplifying it. It's going to take years. It's going to take decades. It's the only way that the human family actually turns this around. Meantime, on the other side, the vibrational side, the spirit side, the consciousness side, yes, there's the rising tide of love and the divine feminine, and without that whole picture, the whole thing is out of balance. So, anyway, we're getting into my other favorite topic, but
okay.
That's
Your other favorite topic.
Does that help? I mean, does that seem relevant to you?
No. I mean, that's fair enough. So you're saying that this court exists, this arbitration court, right?
Right.
And is this the document you sent me that you wanted me to show people?
No,
that's a different document. Okay.
That's actually, there is I can send you, and you've asked me to write a follow-up article if I want, and I will gladly include it. The due diligence package of legal evidence for the existence of the court, which is specifically the licenses, copy of the licenses issued by the government in question.
Okay.
The Institute is licensed as an international law firm, as a university, and as a non-governmental court for the enforcement of international law. And it's from a major country. So,
okay, but you're not naming that country?
No, it's not a particular secret, but, it's just sort of operationally, I don't like to, I have colleagues there who I don't particularly want to shine a bit of attention on. Right now?
Okay. Well, let me just say that Camelot listeners are very good researchers. How hard is it going to be for them to find this information?
It's Egypt.
Oh, all right. All right. Well, fair enough. Right. But at this moment,
it's already out there. Actually, I just have a sort of knee jerk. We're already actually quite frank with it. And the fact that the recent report on Egypt from on the ground, right?
Yes.
So yes,
right.
Yes, Egypt is a whole complex kettle, and there's all kinds of forces at work there. But they are you know, anyway, we have
Okay,
the
fair
evidence.
enough. Now, what about someone is asking in the chat? With our audience, and this is going on a while. I'm going to try to get some questions from the audience. We're going to try to wrap up. So I know I've been really putting you across the coals here, but you've been a good sport, and I really appreciate your very good answers. But there are some people asking about Karen Hudis and the IMF, and have you ever heard? Did you hear my interviews with Karen, for example? Have you heard her interviews elsewhere? Are you familiar with sort of what she has exposed in regard to the IMF? And I actually heard, I don't know if it's a true rumor, that she went back to work now for the IMF. I'm not sure what that means, but she's a lawyer, and have you guys dealt to any degree, because she was exposing some of the corruption, which is on a worldwide basis in terms of the IMF and so on?
Yes, I have followed the Karen Hudis story. There was some interaction last year when I was still doing some writing for Neil Keenan, where they had started to cooperate but fell afoul of each other, and I wrote several posts. Ben Fulford was trying to draw Karen Hudis out about Neil and the Monaco Accords, and I wrote a critical post, a couple of critical posts of Karen's specific actions at that time. Maybe you can help me understand something. The stuff that Karen exposed about the World Bank and the IMF, what was unusual about that was that it was an insider, right? The fact that the IMF is basically a financial hit team to take countries further into debt, and that the World Bank, in fact, accomplishes exactly the opposite of its supposed mission statement, that is not news to the rest of us. The news there was the story that it's an insider at the World Bank coming out with this information. And I understand her role was compliance. She was supposed to see to it that at the upper levels, the World Bank was behaving correctly, and that when she brought up things that were out of line, that she started to be persecuted and then ousted. So, and then, she started to hold forth in various interviews about a lot of stuff that seemed outside her area of expertise. Right. We're all going to die in a comet next week and stuff like that.
Well, okay, but not to, just to keep the focus here. So in terms of her approach and the IMF, are you guys because you're going to have to deal with all of this, right? The IMF, the World Bank, all these so-called bodies out there that are conducting, in other words, what cases are going to be heard in this court that you're, just individual grievances, human rights grievances, and what about countries that are being taken down? On some level, certainly individuals get involved when something like that goes on. But in other words, do you see where I'm going with this?
Right. Part of the reason that the cabal operates above the law, in the sense that you describe, right, is that they think they are above the law. They think that they have certain immunities that cannot be penetrated. In fact, under international law, as I understand it, those immunities can be penetrated. Governmental, military, even judiciary on occasion, individuals can be held accountable. Governments can be held accountable. Now, I am not a member of the court. I am not authorized to say what cases the court would or would not take, but the Judge's Manual of Human Rights, when it comes out, will open the door very, very wide to prosecution of the systemic crimes of the cabal that cover a huge range of how they operate. And that's going to involve many cases of groups challenging governments, individuals challenging governments, individuals challenging private groups, supragovernmental groups, But again, this is not my field. I am not a lawyer. I am not a judge. I am not a member of the court, right? I am a volunteer for the Templar Order, and I am the senior editor of the Alliance Journal, alliancejournal.org, which is an academic journal that is part of the Institute for Sovereign International Security, of which the Arbitration Court of International Justice is a autonomous subdivision. Okay? I just want to make sure I get that right. Just so people know, I am not, believe me, I'm not speaking for the court here. I'm speaking of the court as a supporter and volunteer.
Okay. All right. So let's just look at the future. And let me say that I guess another side to your sort of story is that you've also done a great deal of meditation, and you are known for doing, is it Tibetan chants or any?
No. I'm a kirtan artist. I do a lot of Sanskrit, Hindi, Bengali chants. Specifically, as a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, I do a lot of the chants of Self-Realization Fellowship, which is my own particular spiritual path and community. I've led meditations and chanting at a couple of the different temples there for about 16 years. And I then began to perform at yoga studios and interfaith events around the world. And so the devotional music I do is essentially, there's English translations of Bengali and Hindi chants and Sanskrit. And I love to do, the Bengali and Sanskrit as well. And it's harmonium, tablas, tempura, along with bass and guitar and a few other, electric violin. I have a great band I work with. We're doing a gig at Yoga Works in Pacific Palisades on August 9th. And that's, that's my joy. That's what I most love. And I never would have thought my path would have led to the Knights Templar or a human rights court. But I always had kind of a feeling it was something like this was going to be my focus later in life. So here it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything that you'd like to say, or that hasn't been addressed? I'm kind of looking at the chat right now and seeing whether or not there is anything, any specific questions that I can grab to ask you, and so the people listening who are there, would you type rather quickly into the chat any last minute questions that, based on our conversation, that has maybe answered some of the other questions that were cropping up earlier on in the chat. If you have any direct questions to ask Michael at this time, please do so in caps so that I can see them easily. And let's do that. And then, other than that, while they were giving them a chance to do that, are there any statements kind of that, because there was a reason, besides all these other ways of sort of delving into the things you've been part of, I think there was a purpose for you coming on the show today. So I want to make sure that we address that. Is there anything else you'd like to say in that regard?
Yes, I'm not quite sure the words that will emerge, but there is law and there is love. And as you say, Kerry, the transformational energies that are happening on the planet right now, that's where the true power lies on this planet. That is where the real change will come from. And it is also necessary to uphold Dharma, to uphold the truth, to stand up for the truth, to stand up to protect the innocent, to protect the persecuted. I took an oath of chivalry, and I meant it. And it is everything we ever associated with nobility and service. It's a great thing to aspire to. It's not, it's just a standard I'm trying to reach for. But what I really feel we need to somehow strike a balance. The esoteric heritage of the Templars was about balancing masculine and feminine, the divine feminine and divine masculine. in a balance that would allow the human spirit to fully realize and express itself. That also has a geopolitical corollary, and that's the balance that we need to strike. On the Alliance Journal, you'll see categories of, financial crimes and this, revelation and that. There's also a category for emerging solutions. Just a few weeks ago here in Los Angeles, Amma came to town, Ammaji, the great saint of India. And I had only, I had some information about her. I had gone to one of her satsangs before. I went a couple of weeks ago and I was astonished to learn of the enormous charitable work of love and healing, healing of the environment, children, teaching, empowering women. Love in action is the other side of this coin. And we also need to be upholding Dharma. And so, law alone won't do it. Courts alone won't do it. And that is the thing that inspires me most about aspiring to what it means to be a Knight Templar, is to try to achieve that balance between law and love, and to do it humbly. We can't be focused on personalities, the latest savior of the moment. Personalities come and go. Neil Keenan, Michael Henry Dunn, Kerry, Cassidy, we all come and go. We need institutions based on law and love. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And you have done such amazing work over the years. I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for it. And thanks for the opportunity to let me on here to talk tonight.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Michael. And at this moment, I see it looks like one question here in the chat, so I'll ask it. Do the Knights Templar have anything to do with the creation of religion?
The creation of religion. Okay. You hear a lot in the alternative movement about how religion is a control mechanism instituted by the reptilian bloodlines to keep all us ignorant humans controlled by priests or at war with each other in sects, right? Mm-hmm. The actual heritage of the Knights Templar, in terms of its spiritual truth, actually stretches back about 10,000 years. The order of Melchizedek. If you look in the New Testament, Jesus says to his apostles, I'm sending you out 2 by 2, and know that ye are priests unto the order of Melchizedek. And it was actually Melchizedek who initiated and blessed Abraham. Okay? Father of nations, father of the Abrahamic faith, he was initiated by Melchizedek. There is an esoteric heart at the heart of all the higher religions that has to do with direct communion with Source. Religions are a cultural expression. They are part of the sovereign rights of an individual nation or culture to express itself. And yes, there are control mechanisms. It gets tainted by the cabal every chance they get. Religions get tainted, etc. And at the heart of them all, there is an esoteric truth of divine communion. And that is the heritage of the Knights Templar, that we are sworn to try to do our best to protect sacred knowledge. So to that extent, we, over the millennia, have done our best to be guardians and protectors of sacred knowledge. And religious authority and corruption is a different story. That's my best answer.
Okay. All right. And very well put. All right. So at this moment, Michael, thank you for coming on the show. And
thanks, Kerry.
I appreciate everything. It's been a good discussion. I think people will appreciate it, and it will go, as I said, on YouTube as soon as I can upload it over there. It will continue to be on live stream from this point on, and assuming things go as planned. And And so thank you. And we'll see
All
what
right.
the kind of discussion this generates. I think perhaps as the views increase, more questions and discussion will possibly come to the fore. Certainly, it's a good platform for you to bring awareness of what you
Mm-hmm.
are doing, what Prince Matthew is doing, and or aiming at. And at this moment, do you want to give out your website, any other URLs that people would
I
find
sure do.
valuable?
Yeah.
And also, if
Um,
you have an email address or somewhere people can write to, please say that as well.
okay. The Knights Templar, knightsofsolomon.org, KNIGHTS of Solomon.org. For the Institute for Sovereign International Security, which is also the home of the Human Rights Court, that is www.isis-security.org, isis-security.org. My own personal website for my meditation chants is meditationchantsplural.net, meditationchantsplural.net. I would really encourage everybody to go to thealliancejournal.org. This is an academic journal, a subdivision of ISIS, which is all about very thoroughly researched articles exposing the oligarchy. Again, this is in our strategy of we're a mainstream institution taking it to the heart of what needs to happen. So that's our goal. Anything else?
Is there a contact place
Oh
where people can contact you?
Michael.Dunn, okay, Michael period Dunn, Dunn, at knightsofsolomon.org.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again, and
Well,
everyone. Have a great evening, and hopefully we'll talk again in the future.
I would love that. Thanks so much, Kerry.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. I am here with Michael Henry Dunn, and we're going to be talking about the resurgence of or reconstitution of the Templars, global accounts, and that's a whole different subject. And the rule of law is how he puts it. I'm not so sure I would use that title, but we're going to talk about that. Michael Henry Dunn is a well-known commentator on the global collateral accounts and created the widely seen Changing of the Guard video exposing the banking cabal's abuse of the trillions in off-ledger gold. Let's see, he wrote several dozen widely read posts. He wrote several dozen widely read posts from Indonesia, where he worked directly with Neil Keenan, many people will know that name, for several months in early 2013. He's an authority on the Shakespeare authorship controversy, and he serves on the Sovereign Council of the Sovereign Magistral Order of the Temple of Solomon, is a senior editor of the Alliance Journal, an academic publication devoted to thoroughly researched articles on the unfolding expose of the corrupt oligarchy with an emphasis on restoring human rights through enforcing international law. Okay, so that's the short bio. And you're also a trained actor from the Juilliard School, so want to put that in there. And apparently, you did have a stage career for a number of years, correct?
Right. I wouldn't say I was from the Juilliard School. I did attend the Juilliard School. I attended University of Illinois at Chicago, Knox College, Rosary College. I was in the advanced program at the drama division at the Juilliard School. So yes, that is certainly part of my background. And yes, I'm a classically trained actor, and I had a stage career mostly in Chicago, which is where I'm from, in everything ranging from original plays to Shakespeare, cabaret, musicals. And then I moved to Los Angeles, ostensibly to further my acting career, but at that point, my interest in meditation took the front seat. That had always been a really big part of my life, and I pulled back from the entertainment industry and worked as a vegetarian cook in a monastery for several years in order to immerse myself in meditation and ashram living, because the life of an actor didn't exactly have the discipline that I knew I was going to need if I wanted to get serious about spirituality. And so, story that they were given by their teachers, who were given it by their teachers. It's accepted wisdom. And the underlying primary evidence went unexamined. Because by the time people began to look critically at the Shakespeare biography, which is not until the 18th century, there was already this whole culture of idolatry around Stratford. And it only began to emerge that there were significant, unique, bizarre problems with this story in the early to mid-1800s. As people idolized Shakespeare more and more and wanted to learn more about his life and began to dig, you run into a very significant problem. Now, up front, I'm going to do your viewers a favor and encourage them to check out a website called doubtaboutwill.org. Just doubtaboutwill.org. It's sort of the Shakespeare authorship version of the 1200 engineers and architects who have gone on record as doubting the 9/11 story. There are about 1,100 degreed academics who have publicly signed a declaration of doubt, saying it is reasonable. In other words, it is not crazy. You're not by definition nutso. There is valid reason to seriously doubt the authorship attribution to William Shakespeare of Stratford of what is known as the Shakespeare canon. To me, the most damning, I mean, there's tons of damning evidence, but the fact that, how do we know somebody wrote something, right? Okay. Now, you go back to the contemporary record. We have his name as the author, but then there is a paper trail that is left by, you get paid to write, somebody writes a letter mentioning your writing, you write a letter mentioning your writing, there's a record of education that you were trained in a certain area that you were writing, other people write about your writing between letters to them. These are essential documentary trails that any biographer, any responsible scholar will look at as primary contemporary evidence when they were alive. The evidence we have that established the Stratford man as the author is posthumous. And when you look at, say there's 10 or 11, there's a wonderful book by Diana Price called The Unorthodox Biography of Shakespeare, New Evidence of an Authorship Problem. And when you go back to, I met Dr. Roger Strittmatter, who was the first American scholar to win a PhD from a major American university, University of Massachusetts, with a dissertation based on the premise that the Shakespeare plays were written by someone else, in this case Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. He was given access to Edward de Vere's personal copy of the Bible, which is in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and it was heavily annotated. It's beyond doubt that this was Edward de Vere's personal Bible. He underlined, he wrote little passages, he wrote little notes, and Dr. Strittmatter wrote his dissertation revealing a heavy correspondence between the Shakespeare themes seen by scholars for the last 200 years and the specific underlinings and annotations in the de Vere Bible. So Roger introduced me to the Shakespeare Fellowship. I became very involved and became a trustee. And I was very involved in a number of conferences and debates. I went around the world and the country with a one-man show, Sherlock Holmes and the Shakespeare Mystery, which I've done many places. And so to sort of give a fast forward, that once I became involved in the unfolding story of the global collateral accounts, I was already pretty thoroughly trained in the backstory of lost history that threatens a vested interest. I was pretty thoroughly trained in the give and take of a vested interest fiercely protecting their turf with scruples not in sight. I was also pretty thoroughly trained in how to distill that into an entertaining presentation of a story that would make sense to the general public and cut through the confusion. So as this began to unfold, and when I first started writing with Neil Keenan, it was as if I was primed and ready. I had the storytelling skills built for this.
Okay,
So
but I'm going to stop you right there because I don't want you to leave the subject of the Shakespeare mystery without, completely explaining who Shakespeare really was in your view and why.
Okay. The Shakespeare plays were written by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. There are a few other hands in there. Scholars have always known that. But for most of us growing up in Western culture, we are taught by teachers who, high school teachers don't care so much. But at the college level, they are given those 11 categories that I just mentioned: record of education, record of having been paid to write, record of patronage, and you take 26 different writers from the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, okay? And you look at what we have on those guys. From prominent people like Ben Jonson to obscure people like, Lilly and Kidd and people like that. We have tons of documentary evidence from their lives. Letters by them to others, letters about them between others, record of education. In some cases, we have 10 or 11 extant pieces of evidence. It's voluminous. One glaring exception. The most famous, the most beloved of them all, we have no contemporary literary evidence that the guy wrote a word. And then you have things like, his children were illiterate. I'm sorry. Shakespeare's children being illiterate. He came from an illiterate family. He grew up in a nearly bookless town. He never left England. And then you get into the other side of the case. We like to keep on the Oxford side, as we refer to ourselves, the Earl of Oxford side. We like to keep the Stratford people on the defensive by just saying you could not arrest your man as a writer. And there's 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices who, in a moot court, looked at the evidence and said, sorry, we're lawyers. We look at evidence. You can't arrest this Stratford guy. And the circumstantial evidence indicting Edward de Vere of the crime of being Shakespeare is overwhelming. It is, lawyers look at this and they're used to just the weight of circumstantial evidence. It's beyond the beyond. The coincidences.
Okay, so can you delineate some of the evidence pointing to de Vere then?
Okay. All right. Where to begin?
I mean, we don't have to exhaust the subject, but if you can give me some bullet point evidence that people do look at, and because it sounds like you've got a very strong case, and possibly this whole thing has been settled a long time ago. But just for the sake of the show that we're doing, just
okay. Edward de Vere was first identified as Shakespeare by a man named John Thomas Loney in about the year 1920. And people had been looking at various candidates. There was a big vogue for Francis Bacon. And they were into cryptography. Bacon was Secretary of State for King James. He was a spy master. So then I focused on my work as a writer. I was a story analyst for CBS Entertainment in the movies and miniseries division for several years. Wrote several screenplays. And it was about that time that I became interested in the Shakespeare authorship controversy, which I had always thought was just a bunch of hooey. When I was in the Chicago Shakespeare repertory, somebody would bring up the idea that it was Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe, and it drove me nuts. I just hated the idea. And the standard brush-off from people who, like me, we loved Shakespeare, therefore we loved the guy who was superimposed on the works. The standard brush-off was, oh, you people who can't accept that a middle-class kid from a provincial town could be a brilliant genius. He had to go to Oxford or Cambridge. He had to be some lord. He had to be, an upper strata persona. That was my off-the-cuff brush-off. But in the, I think it was about the late 90s, a monk, actually, who I worked with, gave me a book, which opened my eyes, and then I began to just really delve into the research. And it's really it was a great training ground for the work that I would later do on the global collateral accounts and the whole unfolding story of the Cabal and the freedom movement and what all of us are involved in at this time, because it was an example of conspiracy theory, right, dismissed out of hand, backed by enormous, overwhelming evidence that it requires enormous denial to be blind to. The vested interests protecting the Shakespeare orthodoxy have billions of dollars and academic careers and prestige and everything invested in this. They use ad hominem attack, personal attack, obfuscation, confusion, all the tactics and all the debate and the back and forth in that arena, which I became very involved in. I was a trustee of the Shakespeare Fellowship, which is a not-for-profit, which at that time was based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, dedicated to the scholarly revelation. And that I came to be involved with them